The Story of Civilization, Volume 1, Our Oriental Heritage, Part 1, by Will Durant. Continued. Cassette 10, Side 2. In Ecclesiastes, the problem is given a pessimistic reply. Prosperity and misfortune have nothing to do with virtue and vice. All things have I seen in the days of my vanity. There is a just man that perisheth in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man that prolongeth his life in his wickedness. So I returned and considered all the oppressions that are done under the sun, and beheld the tears of such as were oppressed, and they had no comforter, and on the side of their oppressors there was power. If thou seest the oppression of the poor, and violent perverting of judgment and justice in a province, marvel not at the matter, for there be higher than they. It is not virtue and vice that determine a man's lot, but blind and merciless chance. I saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, neither yet bread to the wise, nor yet riches to men of understanding, nor yet favor to men of skill, but time and chance happeneth to them all. Even wealth is insecure, and does not long bring happiness. He that loveth silver shall not be satisfied with silver, nor he that loveth abundance with increase. This is also vanity. The sleep of a laboring man is sweet, whether he eat little or much, but the abundance of the rich will not suffer him to sleep. Remembering his relatives, he formulates Malthus in a line. When goods are increased, they are increased that eat them. Nor can he be soothed by any legend of a golden past or a utopia to come. Things have always been as they are now, and so they will always be. Say not thou what is the cause that the former days were better than these, for thou dost not inquire wisely concerning this. One must choose his historians carefully. And the thing that hath been, it is that which shall be, and that which is done is that which shall be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything whereof it may be said, See, this is new? It hath been already of old time, which was before us. Progress, he thinks, is a delusion. Civilizations have been forgotten and will be again. In general, he feels that life is a sorry business, and might well be dispensed with. It is aimless and circuitous motion without permanent result, and ends where it began. It is a futile struggle in which nothing is certain except defeat. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What profit hath a man of all his labor which he taketh under the sun? One generation passeth away, and another generation cometh, but the earth abideth forever. The sun also ariseth, and the wind goeth toward the south, and turneth about unto the north. It whirleth about continually, and the wind returneth again according to his circuits. All the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. Unto the place from whence the rivers came, thither they return again. Wherefore I praise the dead which are already dead more than the living which are yet alive. Yea, better is he than both they, which hath not yet been, who hath not seen the evil work that is done under the sun. A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of one's birth. For a time he seeks the answer to the riddle of life in abandonment to pleasure. Then I commended mirth, because a man hath no better thing under the sun than to eat and to drink and to be merry. But, behold, this also is vanity. The difficulty with pleasure is woman, from whom the preacher seems to have received some unforgettable sting. One man among 1,000 have I found, but a woman among all those have I not found. I find more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and nets, and her hands as bands. Whoso pleaseth God shall escape her. He concludes his digression into this most obscure realm of philosophy by reverting to the advice of Solomon and Voltaire, who did not practice it. Live joyfully with the wife whom thou lovest all the days of the life of thy vanity which God hath given thee under the sun. Even wisdom is a questionable thing. He lauds it generously, but he suspects that anything more than a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. Of making many books, he writes with uncanny foresight, there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. It might be wise to seek wisdom if God had given it a better income. Wisdom is good with an inheritance. Otherwise it is a snare and is apt to destroy its lovers. Truth is like Yahweh, who said to Moses, Thou canst not see my face, for there shall no man see me and live. In the end the wise man dies as thoroughly as the fool, and both come to the same odor. And I gave my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all things that are done under heaven. This sore travail hath God given to the sons of man to be exercised therewith. I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and a chasing after the wind. I communed with mine own heart, saying, Lo, I am come to great estate, and have gotten more wisdom than all they that have been before me in Jerusalem. Yea, my heart had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And I gave my heart to know wisdom, and to know madness and folly. I perceived that this also is a chasing after the wind. For in much wisdom is much grief, and he that increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow. All these darts of outrageous fortune might be borne with hope and courage if the just man could look forward to some happiness beyond the grave. But that too, Ecclesiastes feels, is a myth. Man is an animal, and dies like any other beast. For that which befalleth the sons of men befalleth beasts. Even one thing befalleth them. As the one dieth, so dieth the other. Yea, they have all one breath, so that a man hath no preeminence over a beast, for all is vanity. All go unto one place, all are of the dust, and all turn to dust again. Wherefore I perceive that there is nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his own works, for that is his portion. For who shall bring him to see what shall be after him? Whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with thy might, for there is no work, nor device, nor knowledge, nor wisdom in the grave, whither thou goest. What a commentary on the wisdom so lauded in the Proverbs! Here evidently civilization had for a time gone to seed. The vitality of Israel's youth had been exhausted by her struggles against the empires that surrounded her. The Yahweh in whom she had trusted had not come to her aid, and in her desolation and dispersion she raised to the skies this bitterest of all voices in literature to express the profoundest doubts that ever come to the human soul. Jerusalem had been restored, but not as the citadel of an unconquerable god. It was a vassal city ruled now by Persia, now by Greece. In 334 B.C., the young Alexander stood at its gates and demanded the surrender of the capital. The high priest at first refused, but the next morning, having had a dream, he consented. He ordered the clergy to put on their most impressive vestments, and the people to garb themselves in immaculate white. Then he led the population pacifically out through the gates to solicit peace. Alexander bowed to the high priest, expressed his admiration for the people and their God, and accepted Jerusalem. It was not the end of Judea. Only the first act had been played in this strange drama that binds 40 centuries. Christ would be the second, Ahasuerus the third. Today another act is played, but it is not the last. Destroyed and rebuilt, Jerusalem rises again, symbol of the vitality and pertinacity of an heroic race. The Jews, who are as old as history, may be as lasting as civilization. Chapter 13. Persia. 1. The rise and fall of the Medes. Their origins, rulers, the blood treaty of Sardis, degeneration. Who were the Medes that had played so vital a role in the destruction of Assyria? Their origin, of course, eludes us. History is a book that one must begin in the middle. The first mention we have of them is on a tablet recording the expedition of Shalmaneser III into a country called Parsua, in the mountains of Kurdistan, 837 B.C. There, it seems, 27 chieftain kings ruled over 27 states thinly populated by a people called Amadai, Madai, Medes. As Indo-Europeans, they had probably come into Western Asia about 1,000 years before Christ, from the shores of the Caspian Sea. The Zend-Avesta, sacred scriptures of the Persians, idealized the racial memory of this ancient homeland and described it as a paradise. The scenes of our youth, like the past, are always beautiful, if we do not have to live in them again. The Medes appear to have wandered through the region of Bokhara and Samarkand, and to have migrated farther and farther south, at last reaching Persia. They found copper, iron, lead, gold, and silver, marble and precious stones in the mountains in which they made their new home, and being a simple and vigorous people, they developed a prosperous agriculture on the plains and the slopes of the hills. At Ecbatana, that is a meeting place of many ways, in a picturesque valley made fertile by the melting snows of the highlands, their first king, Deioces, founded their first capital. adorning and dominating it with a royal palace spread over an area 2/3 of a mile square. According to an uncorroborated passage in Herodotus, Dioces achieved power by acquiring a reputation for justice, and having achieved power became a despot. He issued regulations that no man should be admitted to the king's presence, but everyone should consult him by means of messengers, and moreover that it should be accounted indecency for anyone to laugh or spit before him. He established such ceremony about his person for this reason, that he might appear to be of a different nature to them who did not see him. Under his leadership, the Medes, strengthened by their natural and frugal life, and hardened by custom and environment to the necessities of war, became a threat to the power of Assyria, which repeatedly invaded Media, thought it most instructively defeated, and found it in fact never tired of fighting for its liberty. The greatest of the Median kings, Cyaxares, settled the matter by destroying Nineveh. Inspired by this victory, his army swept through western Asia to the very gates of Sardis, only to be turned back by an eclipse of the sun. The opposing leaders, frightened by this apparent warning from the skies, signed a treaty of peace and sealed it by drinking each other's blood. In the next year Cyaxares died, having in the course of one reign expanded his kingdom from a subject province into an empire embracing Assyria, Media, and Persia. Within a generation after his death, this empire came to an end. Its tenure was too brief to permit of any substantial contribution to civilization, except in so far as it prepared for the culture of Persia. To Persia the Medes gave their Aryan language, their alphabet of 36 characters, their replacement of clay with parchment and pen as writing materials, their extensive use of the column in architecture, their moral code of conscientious husbandry in time of peace and limitless bravery in time of war, their Zoroastrian religion of Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, their patriarchal family and polygamous marriage, and a body of law sufficiently like that of the later empire to be united with it in the famous phrase of Daniel about the law of the Medes and the Persians, which altereth not. Of their literature and their art not a stone or a letter remains. Their degeneration was even more rapid than their rise. Astyages, who succeeded his father Cyaxares, proved again that monarchy is a gamble in whose royal succession great wits and madness are near allied. He inherited the kingdom with equanimity and settled down to enjoy it. Under his example, the nation forgot its stern morals and stoic ways. Wealth had come too suddenly to be wisely used. The upper classes became the slaves of fashion and luxury, the men wore embroidered trousers, the women covered themselves with cosmetics and jewelry, the very horses were often caparisoned in gold. These once simple and pastoral people, who had been glad to be carried in rude wagons with wheels cut roughly out of the trunks of trees, now rode in expensive chariots from feast to feast. The early kings had prided themselves on justice, but Astyages, being displeased with Harpagus, served up to him the dismembered and headless body of his own son and forced him to eat of it. Harpagus ate, saying that whatever a king did was agreeable to him, but he revenged himself by helping Cyrus to depose Astyages. When Cyrus, the brilliant young ruler of the Median dependency of Anshan in Persia, rebelled against the effeminate despot of Ecbatana, the Medes themselves welcomed Cyrus's victory and accepted him almost without protest as their king. By one engagement, Media ceased to be the master of Persia, Persia became the master of Media, and prepared to become the master of the whole Near Eastern world. 2. The Great Kings. The romantic Cyrus, his enlightened policies, Cambyses, Darius the Great, the invasion of Greece. Cyrus was one of those natural rulers at whose coronation, as Emerson said, all men rejoice. Royal in spirit and action, capable of wise administration as well as of dramatic conquest, generous to the defeated and loved by those who had been his enemies, no wonder the Greeks made him the subject of innumerable romances and, to their minds, the greatest hero before Alexander. It is a disappointment to us that we cannot draw a reliable picture of him from either Herodotus or Xenophon. The former has mingled many fables with his history, while the other has made the Cyropedia an essay on the military art with incidental lectures on education and philosophy. At times Xenophon confuses Cyrus and Socrates. These delightful stories being put aside, the figure of Cyrus becomes merely an attractive ghost. We can only say that he was handsome, since the Persians made him their model of physical beauty to the end of their ancient art, that he established the Achaemenid dynasty of great kings, which ruled Persia through the most famous period of its history, that he organized the soldiery of Media and Persia into an invincible army, captured Sardis and Babylon, ended for 1,000 years the rule of the Semites in western Asia, and absorbed the former realms of Assyria, Babylonia, Lydia, and Asia Minor into the Persian Empire, the largest political organization of pre-Roman antiquity, and one of the best governed in history. So far as we can visualize him through the haze of legend, he was the most amiable of conquerors, and founded his empire upon generosity. His enemies knew that he was lenient, and they did not fight him with that desperate courage which men show when their only choice is to kill or die. We have seen how, according to Herodotus, he rescued Croesus from the funeral pyre at Sardis, and made him one of his most honored counselors. We have seen how magnanimously he treated the Jews. The first principle of his policy was that the various peoples of his empire should be left free in their religious worship and beliefs, for he fully understood the first principle of statesmanship, that religion is stronger than the state. Instead of sacking cities and wrecking temples, he showed a courteous respect for the deities of the conquered, and contributed to maintaining their shrines. Even the Babylonians, who had resisted him so long, warmed towards him when they found him preserving their sanctuaries and honoring their pantheon. Wherever he went in his unprecedented career, he offered pious sacrifice to the local divinities. Like Napoleon, he accepted indifferently all religions and, with much better grace, humored all the gods. Like Napoleon, too, he died of excessive ambition. Having won all the Near East, he began a series of campaigns aimed to free Media and Persia from the inroads of Central Asia's nomadic barbarians. He seems to have carried these excursions as far as the Jaxartes on the north and India on the east. Suddenly, at the height of his curve, he was slain in battle with the Massigitai, an obscure tribe that peopled the southern shores of the Caspian Sea. Like Alexander, he conquered an empire but did not live to organize it. One great defect had sullied his character, occasional and incalculable cruelty. It was inherited, unmixed with Cyrus's generosity, by his half-mad son. Cambyses began by putting to death his brother and rival, Smerdis. Then, lured by the accumulated wealth of Egypt, he set forth to extend the Persian Empire to the Nile. He succeeded, but apparently at the cost of his sanity. Memphis was captured easily, but an army of 50,000 Persians sent to annex the oasis of Ammon perished in the desert, and an expedition to Carthage failed because the Phoenician crews of the Persian fleet refused to attack a Phoenician colony. Cambyses lost his head and abandoned the wise clemency and tolerance of his father. He publicly scoffed at the Egyptian religion and plunged his dagger derisively into the bull revered by the Egyptians as the god Apis. He exhumed mummies and pried into royal tombs regardless of ancient curses. He profaned the temples and ordered their idols to be burned. He thought in this way to cure the Egyptians of superstition, but when he was stricken with illness, apparently epileptic convulsions, the Egyptians were certain that their gods had punished him, and that their theology was now confirmed beyond dispute. As if again to illustrate the inconveniences of monarchy, Cambyses, with a Napoleonic kick in the stomach, killed his sister and wife Roxana, slew his son Prexaspes with an arrow, buried 12 noble Persians alive, condemned Croesus to death, repented, rejoiced to learn that the sentence had not been carried out, and punished the officers who had delayed in executing it. On his way back to Persia, he learned that a usurper had seized the throne and was being supported by widespread revolution. From that moment he disappears from history. Tradition has it that he killed himself. The usurper had pretended to be Smerdis, miraculously preserved from Cambyses's fratricidal jealousy. In reality, he was a religious fanatic, a devotee of the early Magian faith who was bent upon destroying Zoroastrianism, the official religion of the Persian state. Another revolution soon deposed him, and the 7 aristocrats who had organized it raised one of their number, Darius, son of Hystaspes, to the throne. In this bloody way began the reign of Persia's greatest king. Succession to the throne in Oriental monarchies was marked not only by palace revolutions in strife for the royal power, but by uprisings in subject colonies that grasped the chance of chaos or an inexperienced ruler to reclaim their liberty. The usurpation and assassination of Smerdis gave to Persia's vassals an excellent opportunity. The governors of Egypt and Lydia refused submission, and the provinces of Susiana, Babylonia, Media, Assyria, Armenia, Sacia, and others rose in simultaneous revolt. Darius subdued them with a ruthless hand. Taking Babylon after a long siege, he crucified 3,000 of its leading citizens as an inducement to obedience in the rest, and in a series of swift campaigns he pacified one after another of the rebellious states. Then, perceiving how easily the vast empire might in any crisis fall to pieces, he put off the armor of war, became one of the wisest administrators in history, and set himself to re-establish his realm in a way that became a model of imperial organization till the fall of Rome. His rule gave Western Asia a generation of such order and prosperity as that quarrelsome region had never before known. He had hoped to govern in peace, but it is the fatality of empire to breed repeated war. For the conquered must be periodically reconquered, and the conquerors must keep the arts and habits of camp and battlefield. At any moment the kaleidoscope of change may throw up a new empire to challenge the old. In such a situation wars must be invented if they do not arise of their own accord. Each generation must be inured to the rigors of campaigns, and taught by practice the sweet decorum of dying for one's country. Perhaps it was in part for this reason that Darius led his armies into southern Russia, across the Bosporus and the Danube to the Volga, to chastise the marauding Scythians, and again across Afghanistan and 100 mountain ranges into the valley of the Indus, adding thereby extensive regions and millions of souls and rupees to his realm. More substantial reasons must be sought for his expedition into Greece. Herodotus would have us believe that Darius entered upon this historic faux pas because one of his wives, Atassa, teased him into it in bed. But it is more dignified to believe that the king recognized in the Greek city-states and their colonies a potential empire or an actual confederacy dangerous to the Persian mastery of Western Asia. When Ionia revolted and received aid from Sparta and Athens, Darius reconciled himself reluctantly to war. All the world knows the story of his passage across the Aegean, the defeat of his army at Marathon, and his gloomy return to Persia. There, amid far-flung preparations for another attempt upon Greece, he suddenly grew weak and died. 3. Persian life and industry. The empire, the people, the language, the peasants, the imperial highways, trade and finance. At its greatest extent, under Darius, the Persian Empire included 20 provinces or satrapies, embracing Egypt, Palestine, Syria, Phoenicia, Lydia, Phrygia, Ionia, Cappadocia, Cilicia, Armenia, Assyria, the Caucasus, Babylonia, Media, Persia, the modern Afghanistan and Baluchistan, India west of the Indus, Sogdiana, Bactria, and the regions of the Masagetai and other Central Asiatic tribes. Never before had history recorded so extensive an area brought under one government. Persia itself, which was to rule these 40 million souls for 200 years, was not at that time the country now known to us as Persia, and to its inhabitants as Iran. It was that smaller tract immediately east of the Persian Gulf, known to the ancient Persians as Pars, and to the modern Persians as Fars or Farsistan. Composed almost entirely of mountains and deserts, poor in rivers, subject to severe winters and hot arid summers, it could support its 2 million inhabitants only through such external contributions as trade or conquest might bring. Its race of hardy mountaineers came like the Medes of Indo-European stock, perhaps from South Russia, and its language and early religion reveal its close kinship with those Aryans who crossed Afghanistan to become the ruling caste of northern India. Darius I, in an inscription at Naksh-i-Rustam, described himself as a Persian, the son of a Persian, an Aryan of Aryan descent. The Zoroastrians spoke of their primitive land as Aryana Vaijo, the Aryan home. Strabo applied the name Aryana to what is now called by essentially the same word, Iran. The Persians were apparently the handsomest people of the ancient Near East. The monuments picture them as erect and vigorous, made hardy by their mountains and yet refined by their wealth, with a pleasing symmetry of features, an almost Greek straightness of nose, and a certain nobility of countenance and carriage. They adopted for the most part the Median dress and later the Median ornaments. They considered it indecent to reveal more than the face. Clothing covered them from turban, fillet, or cap to sandals or leather shoes. Triple drawers, a white undergarment of linen, a double tunic with sleeves hiding the hands, and a girdle at the waist kept the population warm in winter and hot in summer. The king distinguished himself with embroidered trousers of a crimson hue and saffron-buttoned shoes. The dress of the women differed from that of the men only in a slit at the breast. The men wore long beards and hung their hair in dark curls, or, later, covered it with wigs. In the wealthier days of the empire, men as well as women made much use of cosmetics. Creams were employed to improve the complexion, and coloring matter was applied to the eyelids to increase the apparent size and brilliance of the eyes. A special class of adorners, called kosmetai by the Greeks, arose as beauty experts to the aristocracy. The Persians were connoisseurs in scents and were believed by the ancients to have invented cosmetic creams. The king never went to war without a case of costly unguents to ensure his fragrance in victory or defeat. Many languages have been used in the long history of Persia. The speech of the court and the nobility in the days of Darius I was Old Persian, so closely related to Sanskrit that evidently both were once dialects of an older tongue and were cousins to our own. Old Persian developed on the one hand into Zend, the language of the Zend-Avesta, and on the other hand into Pahlavi, a Hindu tongue from which has come the Persian language of today. When the Persians took to writing, they adopted the Babylonian cuneiform for their inscriptions, and the Aramaic alphabetic script for their documents. They simplified the unwieldy syllabary of the Babylonians from 300 characters to 36 signs, which gradually became letters instead of syllables, and constituted a cuneiform alphabet. Writing, however, seemed to the Persians an effeminate amusement, for which they could spare little time from love, war, and the chase. They did not condescend to produce literature. The common man was contentedly illiterate and gave himself completely to the culture of the soil. The Zend-Avesta exalted agriculture as the basic and noblest occupation of mankind, pleasing above all other labors to Ahura Mazda, the supreme god. Some of the land was tilled by peasant proprietors who occasionally joined several families in agricultural cooperatives to work extensive areas together. Part of the land was owned by feudal barons and cultivated by tenants in return for a share of the crop. Part of it was tilled by foreign, never Persian, slaves. Oxen pulled a plow of wood armed with a metal point. Artificial irrigation drew water from the mountains to the fields. Barley and wheat were the staple crops and foods, but much meat was eaten and much wine drunk. Cyrus served wine to his army, and Persian councils never undertook serious discussions of policy when sober, though they took care to revise their decisions the next morning. One intoxicating drink, the haoma, was offered as a pleasant sacrifice to the gods, and was believed to engender in its addicts not excitement and anger, but righteousness and piety. Industry was poorly developed in Persia. She was content to let the nations of the Near East practice the handicrafts while she bought their products with their imperial tribute. She showed more originality in the improvement of communications and transport. Engineers, under the instructions of Darius I, built great roads uniting the various capitals. One of these highways, from Susa to Sardis, was 1,500 miles long. The roads were accurately measured by parasangs, 3.4 miles. And at every fourth parasang, says Herodotus, there are royal stations and excellent inns, and the whole road is through an inhabited and safe country. At each station a fresh relay of horses stood ready to carry on the mail, so that, though the ordinary traveler required 90 days to go from Susa to Sardis, the royal mail moved over the distance as quickly as an automobile party does now, that is, in a little less than a week. The larger rivers were crossed by ferries, but the engineers could, when they wished, throw across the Euphrates, even across the Hellespont, substantial bridges over which hundreds of skeptical elephants could pass in safety. Other roads led through the Afghanistan passes to India, and made Susa a halfway house to the already fabulous riches of the East. These roads were built primarily for military and governmental purposes, to facilitate central control and administration. But they served also to stimulate commerce and the exchange of customs, ideas, and the indispensable superstitions of mankind. Along these roads, for example, angels and the devil passed from Persian into Jewish and Christian mythology. Navigation was not so vigorously advanced as land transportation. The Persians had no fleet of their own, but merely engaged or conscripted the vessels of the Phoenicians and the Greeks. Darius built a great canal uniting Persia with the Mediterranean through the Red Sea and the Nile, but the carelessness of his successors soon surrendered this achievement to the shifting sands. When Xerxes royally commanded part of his naval forces to circumnavigate Africa, it turned back in disgrace shortly after passing through the Pillars of Hercules. Commerce was for the most part abandoned to foreigners, Babylonians, Phoenicians, and Jews. The Persians despised trade and looked upon a marketplace as a breeding ground of lies. The wealthy classes took pride in supplying most of their wants directly from their own fields and shops, not contaminating their fingers with either buying or selling. Payments, loans, and interest were at first in the form of goods, especially cattle and grain. Coinage came later from Lydia. Darius issued gold and silver darics, stamped with his features, and valued at a gold-to-silver ratio of 13.5 to 1. This was the origin of the bimetallic ratio in modern currencies. 4. An experiment in government. The king, the nobles, the army, law, a savage punishment, the capitals, the satrapies, an achievement in administration. The life of Persia was political and military rather than economic. Its wealth was based not on industry but on power. It existed precariously as a little governing isle in an immense and unnaturally subject sea. The imperial organization that maintained this artifact was one of the most unique and competent in history. At its head was the king, or Kshatra, that is, warrior. The title indicates the military origin and character of the Persian monarchy. Since lesser kings were vassal to him, the Persian ruler entitled himself King of Kings, and the ancient world made no protest against his claim. The Greeks called him simply Basileus, the king. His power was theoretically absolute. He could kill with the word without trial or reason given, after the manner of some very modern dictator. And occasionally he delegated to his mother or his chief wife this privilege of capricious slaughter. Few even of the greatest nobles dared offer any criticism or rebuke, and public opinion was cautiously impotent. The father whose innocent son had been shot before his eyes by the king merely complimented the monarch on his excellent archery. Offenders, bastinadoed by the royal order, thanked his majesty for keeping them in mind. The king might rule as well as reign, if, like Cyrus and the first Darius, he cared to bestir himself, but the later monarchs delegated most of the cares of government to noble subordinates or imperial eunuchs, and spent their time at love, dice, or the chase. The court was overrun with eunuchs who, from their coigns of vantage as guards of the harem and pedagogues to the princes, stewed a poisonous brew of intrigue in every reign. The king had the right to choose his successor from among his sons, but ordinarily the succession was determined by assassination and revolution. The royal power was limited in practice by the strength of the aristocracy that mediated between the people and the throne. It was a matter of custom that the 6 families of the men who had shared with Darius I the dangers of the revolt against false Smerdis should have exceptional privileges and be consulted in all matters of vital interest. Many of the nobles attended court and served as a council for whose advice the monarch usually showed the highest regard. Most members of the aristocracy were attached to the throne by receiving their estates from the king. In return they provided him with men and materials when he took the field. Within their fiefs they had almost complete authority, levying taxes, enacting laws, executing judgment, and maintaining their own armed forces. The real basis of the royal power and imperial government was the army. An empire exists only so long as it retains its superior capacity to kill. The obligation to enlist on any declaration of war fell upon every able-bodied male from 15 to 50 years of age. When the father of 3 sons petitioned Darius to exempt one of them from service, all 3 were put to death. And when another father, having sent 4 sons to the battlefield, begged Xerxes to permit the 5th son to stay behind and manage the family estate, the body of this 5th son was cut in 2 by royal order and placed on both sides of the road by which the army was to pass. The troops marched off to war amid the blare of martial music and the plaudits of citizens above the military age. The spearhead of the army was the royal guard, 2,000 horsemen and 2,000 infantry, all nobles, whose function it was to guard the king. The standing army consisted exclusively of Persians and Medes, and from this permanent force came most of the garrisons stationed as centers of persuasion at strategic points in the empire. The complete force consisted of levies from every subject nation, each group with its own distinct language, weapons, and habits of war. Its equipment and retinue was as varied as its origin: bows and arrows, scimitars, javelins, daggers, pikes, slings, knives, shields, helmets, leather cuirasses, coats of mail, horses, elephants, heralds, scribes, eunuchs, prostitutes, concubines, and chariots armed on each hub with great steel scythes. The whole mass, though vast in number and amounting in the expedition of Xerxes to 1,800,000 men, never achieved unity, and at the first sign of a reverse it became a disorderly mob. It conquered by mere force of numbers, by an elastic capacity for absorbing casualties. It was destined to be overthrown as soon as it should encounter a well-organized army speaking one speech and accepting one discipline. This was the secret of Marathon and Plataea. In such a state, the only law was the will of the king and the power of the army. No rights were sacred against these, and no precedents could avail except an earlier decree of the king. For it was a proud boast of Persia that its laws never changed, and that a royal promise or decree was irrevocable. In his edicts and judgments the king was supposed to be inspired by the god Ahura Mazda himself. Therefore the law of the realm was the divine will, and any infraction of it was an offense against the deity. The king was the supreme court, but it was his custom to delegate this function to some learned elder in his retinue. Below him was a high court of justice with 7 members, and below this were local courts scattered through the realm. The priests formulated the law, and for a long time acted as judges. In later days laymen, even lay women, sat in judgment. Bail was accepted in all but the most important cases, and a regular procedure of trial was followed. The court occasionally decreed rewards as well as punishments, and in considering a crime weighed against it the good record and services of the accused. The law's delays were mitigated by fixing a time limit for each case, and by proposing to all disputants an arbitrator of their own choice, who might bring them to a peaceable settlement. As the law gathered precedence and complexity, a class of men arose called speakers of the law, who offered to explain it to litigants and help them conduct their cases. Oaths were taken, and use was occasionally made of the ordeal. Bribery was discouraged by making the tender or acceptance of it a capital offense. Cambyses improved the integrity of the courts by causing an unjust judge to be flayed alive, and using his skin to upholster the judicial bench, to which he then appointed the dead judge's son. Minor punishments took the form of flogging, from 5 to 200 blows with a horsewhip. The poisoning of a shepherd dog received 200 strokes, manslaughter 90. The administration of the law was partly financed by commuting stripes into fines at the rate of 6 rupees to a stripe. More serious crimes were punished with branding, maiming, mutilation, blinding, imprisonment, or death. The letter of the law forbade anyone, even the king, to sentence a man to death for a simple crime, but it could be decreed for treason, rape, sodomy, murder, self-pollution, burning or burying the dead, intrusion upon the king's privacy, approaching one of his concubines, accidentally sitting upon his throne, or for any displeasure to the ruling house. Death was procured in such cases by poisoning, impaling, crucifixion, hanging, usually with the head down, stoning, burying the body up to the head, crushing the head between huge stones, smothering the victim in hot ashes, or by the incredibly cruel rite called the boats. Because the soldier Mithridates in his cups blurted out the fact that it was he and not the king who should have received credit for slaying Cyrus the Younger at the Battle of Cunaxa, Artaxerxes II, says Plutarch, decreed that Mithridates should be put to death in boats, which execution is after the following manner. Taking 2 boats framed exactly to fit and answer each other, they lay down in one of them the malefactor that suffers upon his back, then covering it with the other, and so setting them together that the head, hands, and feet of him are left outside, and the rest of his body lies shut up within, they offer him food, and if he refuse to eat it, they force him to do it by pricking his eyes. Then, after he has eaten, they drench him with a mixture of milk and honey, pouring it not only into his mouth but all over his face. They then keep his face continually turned toward the sun, and it becomes completely covered up and hidden by the multitude of flies that settle upon it. And as within the boats he does what those that eat and drink must do, creeping things and vermin spring out of the corruption of the excrement, and these entering into the bowels of him, his body is consumed. When the man is manifestly dead, the uppermost boat being taken off, they find his flesh devoured, and swarms of such noisome creatures preying upon, and, as it were, growing to his innards. In this way Mithridates, after suffering for 17 days, at last expired. Some of these barbarous punishments were bequeathed to the invading Turks of a later age and passed down into the heritage of mankind. With these laws and this army, the king sought to govern his 20 satrapies from his many capitals, originally Pasargadae, occasionally Persepolis, in summer Ecbatana, usually Susa. Here in the ancient capital of Elam, the history of the ancient Near East came full circle, binding the beginning and the end. Susa had the advantage of inaccessibility and the disadvantages of distance. Alexander had to come 2,000 miles to take it, but it had to send its troops 1,500 miles to suppress revolts in Lydia or Egypt. Ultimately, the great roads merely paved the way for the physical conquest of Western Asia by Greece and Rome, and the theological conquest of Greece and Rome by Western Asia. The empire was divided into provinces or satrapies for convenience of administration and taxation. Each province was governed in the name of the king of kings, sometimes by a vassal prince, ordinarily by a satrap, ruler, royally appointed for as long a time as he could retain favor at the court. To keep the satraps in hand, Darius sent to each province a general to control its armed forces independently of the governor, and to make matters trebly sure he appointed in each province a secretary, independent of both satrap and general, to report their behavior to the king. As a further precaution, an intelligence service known as the King's Eyes and Ears might appear at any moment to examine the affairs, records, and finances of the province. Sometimes the satrap was deposed without trial, sometimes he was quietly poisoned by his servants at the order of the king. Underneath the satrap and the secretary was a horde of clerks who carried on so much of the government as had no direct need of force. This body of clerks carried over from one administration to another, even from reign to reign. The king dies, but the bureaucracy is immortal. Salaries of these provincial officials were paid not by the king but by the people whom they ruled. The remuneration was ample enough to provide the satraps with palaces, harems, and extensive hunting parks to which the Persians gave the historic name of paradise. In addition, each satrapy was required to send the king, annually, a fixed amount of money and goods by way of taxation. India sent 4,680 talents, Assyria and Babylonia 1,000, Egypt 700, the four satrapies of Asia Minor 1,760, etc., making a total of some 14,560 talents, variously estimated as equivalent to from $160 to $218 million a year. Furthermore, each province was expected to contribute to the king's needs in goods and supplies. Egypt had to furnish corn annually for 120,000 men. The Medes provided 100,000 sheep, the Armenians 30,000 foals, the Babylonians 500 young eunuchs. Other sources of wealth swelled the central revenue to such a point that when Alexander captured the Persian capitals after 150 years of Persian extravagance, after 100 expensive revolts and wars, and after Darius III had carried off 8,000 talents with him in his flight, he found 180,000 talents left in the royal treasuries, some $2,700,000,000. Despite these high charges for its services, the Persian Empire was the most successful experiment in imperial government that the Mediterranean world would know before the coming of Rome, which was destined to inherit much of the earlier empire's political structure and administrative forms. The cruelty and dissipation of the later monarchs, the occasional barbarism of the laws, and the heavy burdens of taxation were balanced, as human governments go, by such order and peace as made the provinces rich despite these levies, and by such liberty as only the most enlightened empires have accorded to subject states. Each region retained its own language, laws, customs, morals, religion, and coinage, and sometimes its native dynasty of kings. Many of the tributary nations, like Babylonia, Phoenicia, and Palestine, were well satisfied with the situation, and suspected that their own generals and tax-gatherers would have plucked them even more ferociously. Under Darius I, the Persian Empire was an achievement in political organization. Only Trajan, Hadrian, and the Antonines would equal it. 5. Zarathustra, the coming of the prophet, Persian religion before Zarathustra, the Bible of Persia, Ahura Mazda, the good and the evil spirits, their struggle for the possession of the world. Persian legend tells how, many hundreds of years before the birth of Christ, a great prophet appeared in Ariana Vaijo, the ancient home of the Aryans. This book is continued on Cassette 11, Side 1.